So we've got a really, really strong panel which is going to be on blockchain governance with our four guests, which is Vlad Zamfir from the Ethereum Foundation, Phil Lucsok from Polkadot, Igor Barinov from POA Network, and Nicolas Bacca who's the CTO of Ledger. So let's all welcome them on and get going.
Are you our moderator?
Yeah, I'm going to be a moderator. I'm going to keep it very open, so I'll let you guys be quite free, and also if you've got a question, please raise your hand as early as possible.
Don't let anyone drag on too boring for too long.
Definitely. Please, could all of you maybe introduce yourself and what you're most interested in related to governance? Maybe starting with Vlad.
Hi, I'm Vlad Zamfir. I work on consensus protocols, and I'm interested in consensus protocol governance because I don't want to regret my life decisions in the future where consensus protocols are used to do terrible, terrible things.
My name is Phil Lucsok. I work for Parity Technologies and Polkadot Network, and I'm interested in governance after realizing that governance is the most important thing to all this, after trying to flee political, regular, traditional governance systems. And yeah, with distributed governance, we have a lot to work on to make sure that they don't fall into the same pitfalls democracy has and everything else.
Yeah, so I'm Nicolas Bacca, I'm CTO at
Your microphone is working.
Okay, thanks. So nice governance on the mic. So I'm Nicolas Bacca, CTO and co-founder of Ledger. So we are not directly playing a role in governance, I would say. We are in an interesting position because we are helping people reaching governance with proprietary technologies that we like to open a little bit more. So it could be a governance discussion in itself. And on the other side of governance, we are at the forefront of seeing what happens when people disagree with governance, with the different Bitcoin forks, for example, that we have seen in our wallets and the different Ethereum forks. So I'm interested to see how people define governance, because I believe that that's something that's missing probably today. The first, if we take our first reference paper with Satoshi white paper, for example, it says that miners are deciding the rules with their hash power, but we don't really define how we transition from a set of rules to another. So I would say it's kind of a very interesting open problem right now.
Hi guys, my name is Igor from POA Network. POA Network is a US-based public self-governed permission network. It sounds like oxymoron, right? But it is not. And on-chain governance gave us this possibility to build a public permission network. So it's an essential part of a simple control mechanism. And we're mostly focused on R&D in this space. So we're building tools and processes for on-chain governance and public permission networks. And this network is focused on immediately available scalability solution for Ethereum ecosystem. So the network is live since December 2017, two-way pegged to Ethereum. So tokens can be transferred in decentralized and trustless way between networks and used by a couple of apps to solve their scalability issues.
Okay. So I think one of the things that's already been opened there is maybe a definition would be interesting for on-chain versus off-chain governance and what both of those might mean. Phil?
Sure. So to me, the on-chain and off-chain governance is something that everyone's been talking about a lot, and it's a huge. I look at it as a spectrum from off-chain, which is like pre-blockchain governance, to on-chain, which is as much as you possibly can, every single input and data point you can put on-chain so that it's transparent and accountable and can be included in the decision-making process so that everyone can see. So it goes from one end to another. There's many places in the middle where we can find balances depending on the network or community.
So the main thing that I normally think of as being associated with on-chain governance is the idea that there will be automatic software upgrades. Whereas like lots of other things that are somewhat on-chain and somewhat governance usually don't aren't the main thing that comes to mind when I think about on-chain governance. So like for me, on-chain governance is mostly about automatic software upgrades, like to have like a mechanism in the consensus protocol that like approves upgrades that automatically get downloaded and installed by nodes. Do you also think about software upgrades, Phil, when you're thinking about on-chain governance?
Yes, I do, but it depends on the governance model that allows these upgrades to be added to the network.
But all on-chain governance has that?
Does all on-chain governance involve automatic software upgrades?
Because I think a better term is binding governance. So you bind the decision that you formalize and declare, and yes, as soon as that vote time gets passed, for example, then yeah, it would be bound to the vote and automatically install.
So bound means that like your software will install something? Like I'm not sure what bound means. So you say bound, and I don't know what that is.
It means that if there's a threshold of 50% of people vote on something, it will be implemented in that way. Just as like a vote is naturally binding.
But I mean, like, you could imagine that happening on-chain or off-chain. It doesn't seem to be particularly on-chain. Just, right? Like...
yeah, it does, because the voting or consensus is on-chain and transparent. It's written in the...
I mean, there's lots of, we've experimented with voting protocols for millennia, you know? So basically, like, imagine we have a vote off-chain, and then it's binding, and we all install it as a result. But, you know, not via automatic software upgrades, but just via, you know, the legitimacy of the vote. Like, you know, that's not on-chain governance, right? So it's not like, so the binding thing is like specifically binding and recognized by the software.
Yep.
Right. Okay. So we're agreeing that we're talking about automatic software upgrades.
Yes, we are. Let me agree to that, but I just want to make the point. The thing is with automatic, it can lead to, and I know what Vlad's talked about before many times in his criticisms of on-chain governance, is that the automatic software upgrades could be risky because they can speed up the process. But the automatic software upgrades really come down to the governance mechanism in your blockchain. So if you decide to have very, very hard thresholds to cover that go through testing, where you include the tests to be checked and you include high voting thresholds, then that would be the automated part.
Yeah, I just want to mention that like the main thing that I like to say, the main reason why I don't like automatic upgrades is that they disenfranchise node operators. It doesn't really have to do with the speed or the tech risk, just that they disenfranchise participants in governance who participate in governance today.
Can I just say, well, the node operators are incentivized not as node operators alone. They have their other means to run a node, and that includes being an exchange. You want to verify your own transactions, accepting payments, and all these other examples. And for those people, as node operators, it's more important that they are able to run their node as an exchange, not as a node operator. And if that includes installing upgrades that increase the block size, as long as your software can naturally handle that, but it does benefit you as an exchange or a payment processor, then by all means, accept the upgrades.
My opinion, I'm not exactly, I'm not exactly happy with automatic software updates, from a security standpoint. I would say that the way I view the on-chain governance would be mostly collecting signals, in my opinion. So collecting the best signals that can let us act then off-chain, and typically to do stuff like performing those upgrades. So because, well, we might want to perform them, or we might want to just skip them and think about something else, for different reasons. Maybe just validating the quality of reproduction of the software in a production system. I don't think we have seen right now an example of an on-chain governance working properly. So I don't know if anybody has an example of something in mind.
Yeah, so for me, on-chain governance is a complex thing, right? It's because it has multiple meanings. For example, one essential part for a POA network is to have on-chain governance as Zibel control mechanism. Usually people mix consensus and Zibel control. Usually consensus agrees on a set of messages, right? And Zibel control decides who are validators and who are people who create blocks, right? So for POA network, it's permissioned network, so there's a group of people who can create blocks, right? But the main question is how this group is created and operated. And is it operated by a central entity, which we usually see in private blockchains or private federated permissioned network, or it's something like public permissioned network where a group is self-governed. Self-governed means that they have on-chain tools where decisions they made through public votes included in consensus if threshold is reached. So this is one essential part of on-chain governance for POA, is who are validators and why they are validators. Right, also it gives transparency. When we think about on-chain governance, it's not only about processes, it's not only about how we modify something in the state, and also it's about tools to get information from the blockchain. For example, we built a tool to get notification on governance events, and it helps protect the governance mechanism from censorship, because any validator can set up this notification tool and get these governance events and no one can block him. And also it's decentralized statistic tools, because when you have on-chain governance, it's very interesting to know how actually validators or other participants participate in these processes. Right, so it's a complex topic, and it includes processes and tools. Well, answering to your question, we have this on-chain governance in production since December, and yeah, I'll present it tomorrow.
Yeah, but so maybe we just haven't seen an on-chain governance that does automatic software upgrades that really works. But even if we did, and I would be not surprised at all if we do. I think that the premise that people will use the on-chain governance mechanism to make decisions, and that the on-chain governance mechanism will make decisions more transparent, are very questionable. I think people will make the decisions off-chain in private rooms between the people who have the power to make decisions, and then they will put their signals on the chain in order to play the game and show everyone what they're doing. I actually think that we are much better at keeping people to account and at doing transparency off-chain than we are doing it on-chain. On-chain, we're talking about a very, very immature set of tools that have very, very limited ability to do I/O with anything. We're talking about smart contracts. We're talking about programs that can't even have a TCP/IP connection. We're talking about things that okay, well, let me take a step back. On-chain governance is equivalent to the Oracle problem. It's at least as hard as the Oracle problem. And we know kind of fundamentally that the Oracle problem is susceptible to collusion by the participants and is only really workable in a fault tolerance model. So you really need to assume that there's a majority honest and participating in order for an on-chain governance model to work. So you're working in an environment where we have a problem that we know is kind of fundamentally insoluble on-chain, even though we know very well how to deal with it off-chain. And because of the limitations of smart contracts. And putting it on chain, claiming that it's going to be, more transparent and more accountable, I think is questionable. Would you put the EAPS process on chain? Would more people be able to access the EAPS process if the EAPS process was on chain?
To answer the question, to go to your point of you need to assume that there's more honest actors than dishonest actors in an on-chain model. The same threshold. Okay, the same is true for Bitcoin in mining right now. You need to assume in distributed systems that there are more honest actors than dishonest actors.
But miners don't control the protocol.
Yeah, and that's the problem. Is what we see on the on-chain. Mining is on-chain. You can verify who's mining what. You can verify everything. And for the on-chain mechanisms you see more honest actors than dishonest actors. For the off-chain mechanisms, very, very questionable in Bitcoin right now. And they have been, especially when they included signals that included non-Sybil resistant signals in their governance upgrades. And that was all done off-chain.
All right. Let's do a show of hands. Who trusts Bitmain? Who trusts Bitcoin Core? All right. I mean, I think it's very, very true that Bitcoin Core is much more transparent than Bitmain. I think that the reason why on-chain governance is, or that why blocks are so accountable in Bitcoin is like, oh, you know, you can check whether it's valid with a program. You can't check whether on-chain governance decisions are valid with a program. Not if we're talking about arbitrary changes to the software. And so like the accountability that we have available to us on-chain is just much lower than the accountability that we can do off-chain. Off-chain we have like human interpreters. On-chain we have smart contracts, which are basically trash.
So to keep things moving, I think it would be interesting to hear maybe a bit more about the on-chain governance plan by Polkadot and maybe some of the aspects like councils and how you see those mitigating some of the concerns. Or
So yeah, Polkadot Network is going to launch with a proof-of-stake model that's really everything comes down to the coin holders. And in order to have this, there's a lot of issues right now, as we've seen with current examples of POS models, DPoS in particular. The models are still in progress, but the main basis is already out there, and you can read it. Mostly it's a way, Polkadot is a way to connect different blockchains together and through a relay chain. And that relay chain is meant to be extremely generic and minimal. It's only meant to do transfer of information between different blockchains. And the governance on that is built on based on coin voting, and that uses adaptive quorum-based voting. Where the more participants you have, the more 50% threshold needed to accept an upgrade. If there's low turnout, you need very, very high thresholds to overcome that. So if there's only 10%, for instance, of participation, then you need something around 80% yes, as opposed to, and then if you have 50%, then you need 50%, so on. And things will be proposed on-chain. You will be able to verify the software that is being run, hopefully being run on a testnet already, and you will be able to see that it is tested and working. And yeah, it's just a baby step in the spectrum to putting more things on chain, so that the high throughput of social action that is always off-chain, there's always an exit node, you know, there's always an exit to off-chain stuff, is reducing, and we can keep progressing and have more transparency.
But if we were to rely on the off-chain mechanisms less, like, don't you think that they're going to become less? So imagine if the default is that the off-chain mechanisms don't do anything. Don't you think that people are going to be less likely to use them? Like, so, like, my main concern is that, like, oh, if the default is to follow the on-chain mechanism, then, like, the idea that, like, node operators can resist an upgrade by, like, not upgrading, I think is, like, weakened, right? Because, like, they're used to not doing anything.
And that's a good point, and that's part of the problem we have with participation in governance right now, is that the node operators, are defaulting to no. And that default is very, very powerful. And this is really good arguments. And the thing is, it comes down then to the governance process. If you have node operators accepting automatic software upgrades in the most radical form, you should protect that by building a very good model that everyone can access and participate in, so that everyone can see who's voting for what, how the system works, how the system can be adapted and changed to avoid more collusion, how more inputs can be added, make it more transparent, and so on.
So we have upgradable on-chain governance. It's already working on POA Network, and recently validators added new type of ballot. But we think that these decisions can be censored by validators in future to upgrade the protocol or not. So that's why we decided to implement a censorship-resistant BFT consensus, known as Honey Badger BFT. And combining this consensus with POA type of networks, we can achieve enforcement of these collective decisions of validators And before the decision is enforced, validators cannot resist it because when they create blocks, they operate on encrypted data. And this is a good point of censorship-resistant BFT consensus algorithm, and I think this is the future from censorship-resistant from malicious validators. But after they reveal a block with a governance decision, and they decrypt all transactions within this block, if someone is not agreeing with this decision, then this validator becomes a malicious validator and will be punished by the consensus.
Well, on that topic, yeah, well, I would say I don't have any specific view on that topic. I mean, other than, yeah, I wouldn't myself be trusting automatic software updates. So I would be quite wary of it, I guess. A lot of people in the space, I mean, operating those nodes with strong economic nodes probably would be wary of that. So even if that's something that we put in the protocol as design, I mean, and we know that people are working on that, I guess that we will still be discussing the decisions that happens off-chain. So typically, which upgrade gets put on that. I mean, who is signing the software upgrade? I mean, which is a very silly question, but an important one if we want to distribute it to everybody. So yeah, so I still think that this will lead to debates, and those debates won't be solved on-chain.
Yeah, just because I have mic, I'd like to add about smart contracts, that on-chain governance with smart contracts is like machine-to-machine type of communication. Well, if you compare, for example, a POA implementation in Click and Kovan, basically in Click, voting for validators are performed in block headers, and then in Kovan in smart contracts. And if you have smart contract, you can implement custom logic, right? You can build more levels of abstraction, and at the end of the day, for validators, it will be human-readable proposals and decisions and thresholds. So UX experience is in on-chain governance is very important. And for example, our validators of POA Network, they're not like professional validators; they're individuals, and sometimes some of them cannot read smart contracts and execute them. But they have dApps where they can, any of these validators can propose a ballot, and he should put some user human-readable description of this ballot. And if they don't put it, then most likely this ballot will not be accepted by other validators. So I think that on-chain governance is not that dumb as some people think about this. People can make groups if you have more than, well, for example, in POA there are 21 validators at the moment, and they have the same setting for onboarding. They're like individuals, US residents with no previous criminal record, fingerprinted, basically KYC validators, but they form their own groups. There are West Coast validators, East Coast validators, Asian validators, Russian-speaking validators, validators from Midwest, women validators, LGBT validators, all this type of groups forming within 21 people. And then, and you can see this group forming when, someone proposes a ballot. You can see that this ballot is supported by some subset of these validators. Means that there is one group within this group, but this group is not defined by on-chain governance. So it became a mix of on-chain and off-chain, obviously, because there are people behind it.
I actually think that it's super fundamental that on-chain governance is going to be paired with off-chain governance, because the people who have the power in on-chain governance, the coin holders, for example, in Polkadot's model, are going to talk to each other in a Telegram channel and figure out what to do off-chain, because those channels are much more convenient from a user experience point of view, and they're much more private, and they're much more safe for them to not say anything that's going to embarrass them and make everyone look bad. But I wonder, do you know the distribution of dots? Do you have KYC'd all of the buyers, and you know who has how many coins?
The token sale did have KYC, but it was it's protected from us. So it was done using a passport ICO service, but that's just the initial token sale, and then once it goes into the open market, anything can change.
So it's going to be like 5 dudes. 5 dudes are going to have like 50% of the coins or more. Or maybe 3 dudes, or maybe 2 dudes in a corporation, or 3 dudes in 2 corporations.
What's Ethereum like?
I mean, it's really bad, and I would never, ever, ever trust the coin holders of Ethereum with the future of Ethereum governance. It would be completely unconscionable to me to give 5 dudes, 6 dudes, 10 dudes, 20 dudes, whatever, a small number of dudes, or dudes in corporations, control and outright complete ownership of the platform, where they literally get to put any software upgrade through, and like they outright will own it. I mean, like it doesn't take long for a lawyer to figure out who owns something, and like they will figure it out, and these people will become bound, because we were talking about people that are operating a platform that is doing all sorts of illegal stuff, and they literally own it if they can cause arbitrary changes and manage it in an arbitrary way.
All I'm saying, back to the transparency point of this, is that we don't see the same collusion in Ethereum right now, as opposed to all the other. We see some evidence that has come out from EOS, of course, and perhaps we're seeing this because it is being done on chain.
Or maybe because the coin holders don't have that power in Ethereum. They like don't have that power, and so why would they collude to do?
The question is also whether they don't have that power or whether they don't have it as transparently but still end up making those decisions by having those backroom chats and influencing other people.
You know, I'm sure it's a little bit of both, but it's also a thing where there are political realities that make it extremely challenging for people to push arbitrary changes through the protocol, because everyone has to accept it via the hard fork mechanism. And so, you know, I'm sure a lot of people would love their funds unstuck. It still hasn't happened.
Okay, we're going to take a quick question on that note for a break from someone in the audience. If you want to introduce yourself and then go ahead.
All right. So, yeah, my name is Noah. I'm a community member of the Decred project. And for the people that don't know Decred is a Bitcoin-like digital currency that has a form of governance integrated into its blockchain. And actually, this governance model has been live for over 2 years already. So people have been voting for upgrades to the Decred consensus rules, and several automated hard forks have been taking place on the Decred blockchain. So to answer the question from the Ledger guy, yeah, there are examples of on-chain governance that are actually live. That was one point I wanted to make. The other point I wanted to make is that Vlad, you said that on-chain governance is less accountable than off-chain governance. Or did I paraphrase that right or not?
Not quite.
Yeah.
I said we know how to do accountability better off-chain than we know how to do it on-chain. So the technology that we have for accountability is better and more sophisticated, more mature off-chain than on-chain.
So the way I want to challenge this is accountability is largely a result of transparency. So governance is about making decisions. And the way those decisions are made should be transparent. If it's transparent, it's accountable. When you have on-chain votes, it's completely transparent how the vote went, how the decision was made. When you do that off-chain, it's way less transparent. There can be all sorts of forms of bribery or other forms of corruption of the development team. So the off-chain governance processes, I think, are way less transparent than an on-chain vote. Hence, more transparency on-chain and more accountability.
Yeah, so just maybe on my point, yeah, sorry, when I was asking if we have already some live examples, well, maybe I should have added, well, live examples where we have seen some well, we have seen some significant stake, put into the protocol, because I think one of the things that we have seen so far is that everything works in a test tube. People have been doing 1 gigabyte blocks on Bitcoin Cash. I'm not sure it's a good view of what could happen if 1 gigabyte blocks were deployed on the network. So even when we transition to on-chain governance, I think one of the problems is that bad actors have absolutely no incentive of revealing themselves when the protocol is being tested. So if at some point we have, everybody agrees that upgrade, will happen on-chain, then, well, you can get that the actors colluding with themselves will not reveal themselves until it's interesting for them. So basically until everything is deployed and they can move the protocol where they want to go. So yeah, I think I will be curious and interested when I see on-chain governance implemented on something like Bitcoin and Ethereum, for example, to transition from one set of rules to another. I think, yeah, to stay inside the same set of rules and decide a set of rules inside what we probably decided, I think, yeah, that's work, but the transition is the tricky part there.
Hello, I'm Jordi Bailina, a member of the Ethereum community, and well, I just would like to, because I think that you mixed like a lot of terms, and I would like to at least to see how do I divide the things. First thing is governance. Governance, as Vlad says, is a human thing, so it's something that happens intrinsically off-chain. It's about relationship and about humans taking decisions on that. That's my understanding of humans. The interesting thing is when we want to make this, when we want to make the decision made, we want to make them accountable, and then is when we can use some tools in order to, to notarize or to make sure to give transparency to this. And this is just a tool. We could use a centralized tool to make this governance, this decision making accountable. It could be a centralized tool. It could be even another chain. The interesting thing here is when we use the same chain as a tool in order to make this voting or this decision making, this governance decision, to use this tool in the same chain. And the advantage of doing this, and this is what I would like to split, is once we make that accountable, so we all agree that this is the decision making that, then is when we can do the automatic upgrade on the same chain. But the automatic upgrade for me the automatic upgrades of the software has nothing to do with the governance part. The automatic upgrade is just the execution of a decision made before. Okay. So one thing is decision, it's human, then we do it. We notarize, we put it in the blockchain, and once we agree on that decision that was taken before, then we do the software upgrade. But I think these are 3 different steps.
Yeah, I don't disagree, except for the fact that the software upgrade has to come from a single source. There has to be like a single contract that signals what the upgrade is. And it absolutely isn't the case that governance has to be determined by a monolithic decision-making process that outputs a single decision for everyone. So by using the automatic software upgrade mechanism, you force it to be a single source of that truth. And then that means that and then when you post all of those notarized things on there to create it, make it transparent, what you're actually doing is creating a huge opportunity for people to buy votes and to bribe people for them, because actually you can do that in an automated and extremely credible manner via smart contracts. Smart contracts are actually very good at buying votes of on-chain governance mechanisms. Exceptionally good at it. That's something they are good at in terms of governance. They're really good at bribing governance participants if they're putting messages on-chain. I think the whole idea of coercion resistance in voting system has been completely thrown out the window by the on-chain governance community, because they believe that seeing the votes is actually good for the voting system, when in fact the empirical and historical evidence is that it leads to capture of the system via people who hold them to account for how they cast the votes. So I think that there's a lot actually. There's definitely a lot going on, there's different components, and I don't disagree about the way you split it up, but I think that the fact that they're tied together and put on-chain does actually have significant impacts on the architecture and on the actual governance of the system. But most of all, when you say these signers are enough to pass the decision, those are now the owners of the blockchain. And that's something we don't have in our off-chain governance mechanism today. And it's something that I hope we'll never have. I hope that the blockchain is never owned. Because If it is, then we will basically just have governance of the kind that we're quite used to, being owned.
So one of the issue with the vote buying and everything and all this collusion is not that the fact that it's on chain, because even if you were to have, I've heard opponents of on-chain governance argue that there are some identity-based solutions, as if that would putting one head, one vote is a better model for this instead of giving it to the coin voters. Where that's when you open up to bribery by influence, and influential people maintain their power and compound that power and can do that in another way. So it's a matter of heuristics and models at that point. So and that's the thing, going back to what I was saying about the spectrum of this, some things that are low-hanging fruit make sense to put on chain sometimes. And if you have those low-hanging fruit, put it on chain and it doesn't corrupt the system and you see that it's working, well then you should test out another model, maybe add that to your system in the future until it's a process of putting things on chain. Just it started with Bitcoin. Bitcoin put everything on chain as far as accounting of money. And we can slowly get to putting more things on chain.
So if you have any other questions, you raise your hand and we'll bring it around.
Do you think that in order to make on-chain governance more legitimate, we have to find completely new models of the initial distribution of tokens that aren't essentially just buying the tokens?
I think the main thing is that you need to find a way to not disenfranchise people who are participating in governance today. The main thing is that you have to think of a system that doesn't exclude people who are currently participating and currently have a role. And this is the challenge. I mean, even the one person, one identity thing. The influencers thing. There's all sorts of things you could try to do to make sure that people who are participating today are going to continue to participate. But I think the number one thing that you need to do, if you are hoping that on-chain governance is going to be legitimate, is to convince participants in the blockchain community today that their interests will be represented and that they won't be disenfranchised.
I agree. And we've seen the same thing with Bitcoin. Bitcoin started off with one miner mining its first 100 blocks, and over time, more miners got more influence and more powerful, and then over time miners got less influential as a whole, and these systems can evolve. As long as you have adaptive systems that do reflect the community that is joining and you allow people to continue to participate, then yeah, by all means. Token distribution is very important as a seed thing, and it should be considered carefully. But as long as you continue to allow more participants and keep it as permissionless as possible, then you should.
How would you change the game theoretical elements in order to make it so that people wanted to have a model that gives people incentive to have more say in the network in terms of governance and not just about return on capital?
Yeah, so the question was, how would you change the game theory elements to make it more permissive, or?
To have people incentivized to want to have control over the network and not just get return on their money.
To be incentivized to participate as opposed to be incentivized to make more money. Yeah, that's exactly the thing. My point is make it adaptive. Make it adaptive as possible. Make it adaptive, allow for more inputs and more participants so that it can change and live.
Yeah, I'd like to add to the initial question. I think we should experiment with new governance models for both on-chain and off-chain. Well, it's easier to experiment with on-chain governance. For example, one thing that we found interesting and working is embedding on-chain governance into consensus algorithm. For example, in POA, all decisions made by validators, for example, who are validators, they enforce it on consensus level. If they upgrade smart contracts, changing implementation proxy smart contract, this is enforceable and it's a part of consensus, right? If validators voted you out, then you're not a miner anymore, right? If validator voted you in, you're a miner. Validators can vote you in as a miner and also as a participant of governance, and they make these decisions themselves. So one more model we're exploring now and planning to launch it in next month is a Hartspoon type of blockchain. So in this network, the network will start without emission and without pre-mine, so it will be empty Ethereum compatible network, and all native currency will be moved from Ethereum ERC20 token, for example Tether, into this sidechain. So it will be USD based sidechain, and governance model will be different, right? Validators can only decide only on collateralized Tether on Ethereum side, but they cannot change emission or somehow give token holders to vote, right? Because token holders can move back this emission at any time using this decentralized bridge. So and this gives us a new governance models. Okay, who will be validators in this network, right? And most likely there will not be individuals, but more likely there will be companies, and they will have some different tools and different responsibilities. So my answer is we need to experiment, and the best way to experiment is to build, right?
I mean, I don't disagree in the abstract that we need to experiment, but I think that there are very, very, very high-risk experiments out there. I think that the future of blockchain governance is very likely to be path-dependent, which means that the things that we experiment with early are very likely to be the things that we're going to end up with. And if we experiment with plutocracy, I think it's very likely that we're going to end up with plutocracy. If we experiment with a few dudes owning the blockchain, I think it's very likely that we're going to end up with a few dudes owning the blockchain. And I think that we should have foresight and only do and be careful about our experimental design and understand that experiments are costly and that they might lead to a very different future. And so I think we need to think ahead as much as possible and to understand what are the risks that we're taking, and to not treat these as low-stakes experiments, but as very, very high-stakes experiments. High-stakes experiment, like the whole blockchain space's future level of stakes.
Yeah, I think it's good that we have high-stakes experiments for once. I mean, governance is a very important process. Finding the right process for value-bearing networks to adapt to humanity is a really good thing. Yes, it's high risk, and I wouldn't recommend my grandma getting involved in blockchain governance and blockchains and cryptocurrencies when you have a lot of skin in the game. The goal long term is that hopefully this will be decentralized out further, and then yeah, but I'm glad I'm seeing some high-risk experiments right now. It's showing us a lot of stuff we can learn from.
Yeah, I'm terrified of high-risk experiments that I know are going to fail, or that I know are going to lead to dystopia.
Thanks for the discussion. It's really going great. Governance is not a topic of today. I think it's we're discussing for more than 1,000 years in this space. One important part when I'm observing the discussion on the governance and blockchain, the crucial element that everybody is missing is freedom of expression. Without the freedom of expression, you cannot have a transparency. And without transparency and freedom of expression going side by side, you cannot have governance. Is there any structure that you think that something is working on the freedom of expression? Because expression is one part if you are restricting and you are not giving priority to that. I think no technology governance can actually achieve, and that's very fundamental. So just one question.
I mean, I think that we're really lucky to be able to benefit from the freedom of political speech that we have in the Western world right now. I mean, I express myself nonstop, very openly on Twitter, and I encourage everyone to do the same. And I think actually we have an opportunity to use the freedom of speech that we've garnered through the political process in the world. In this context, because what we're really talking about is I think political expression and political speech that is really necessary for governance, and that's something that I think we deeply understand in the tradition of democracy and of even the legal tradition, and I think that your right to free speech exists and is protected to an extent that is unreasonable even in many societies. And so, I mean, I personally enjoy a level of ability to express myself that I think has nothing to do with blockchain, and that is just to do with liberal society that doesn't correct me too much for expressing myself. And it makes it like actually legally protected for me to express political thoughts. And I think that like without that, I think we would be screwed. I think that like because we can express our interests and our politics, that we have a hope of making blockchain governance work. So yeah, I mean, I totally agree. But I think like, you know, thankfully we already got our freedom of speech, at least in a lot of countries.
But it is not about freedom of speech. Expression includes quite one. So speech is one part of the expression. Mm-hmm. Expression can be anything, right? Okay. It can be also bodily movement, it can be also your gesture, it can be also your act or conduct. Sure. It is not required to be the First Amendment of US freedom of speech, but it covers a wider spectrum. So in the network participants, I do not see this priority of the expression of the network participants. And it's not about token holders, it's also the actors, the other actors.
I don't know, actually, if anything, I see, like, I spend a lot of time on Twitter, and I see a tremendous amount of participation from, like, loads of actors, anonymous, named, coin holders, non-coin holders, passive observers, no coiners, lawyers, just a tremendously diverse group of stakeholders who I actually hear much more expression from the community, you know, on Twitter than I think I ever will on the blockchain, at least like in the next few years.
Yeah, part of that is we don't have real decentralized messaging platforms that have garnered the attention right now, but hopefully we can see that and transition toward that in the future so that anyone, no matter which Western, Eastern world, Eastern nations where freedom of speech is not there, but expression, if you do express yourself, has a lot more impact. That's something I would really like to see. If again, it's in the will, in the interest of the participants involved.
Yeah, maybe it's also good that the one does not exclude the other. So you can have an off-chain, you know, freedom of expression, and you can have on-chain voting. So I think those two can mutually reinforce each other as well. I wanted to react to one of the questions here from the audience. And I think the question was about the game theory. How do you make sure that the people who have voting rights actually make good decisions? Because that is I think a very fundamental question to blockchain governance. You want if the decisions are made on the blockchain, you want those participants to make the right decisions for the network. And the way that we are solving that in the Decred project is that we make sure that the participants have skin in the game, that the participants who vote and make the decisions are actually incentivized to make the right decisions for the whole network. And I would like to hear your thoughts on how you can make sure that people have skin in the game and that decisions are made correctly.
So the lowest hanging fruit right now is giving voting to coin holders, and that's a very risky. I understand it's a very risky process, but it's also the one that is civil resistant, so that you can't repeat many Twitter accounts who appear like thousands of people talking to Vlad. It could be one guy.
That can't be one guy.
That's me. Yeah, you can really make sure that the distribution is done honestly, and that you can have the actors in the system. And then it really just comes down to the participants, what they want to achieve themselves. You can have many other ways of, if you do want an identity-based system to really allot the votes, you can do that as well. And putting things on chain doesn't make it coin voting. This is something that often gets put together because it is the lowest hanging fruit in the first experiment. But there are many other ways we can have civil resistant participation so that we can create systems that are healthy, that keep the incentive right where they should be.
Sorry, I have actually a very different answer, which is that actually I think it's fundamentally impossible to secure voting systems with incentives. I think that because there's no way to tell whether someone is voting honestly with an incentive mechanism. There's no way to use an incentive mechanism to get people to vote correctly. And I think actually, so skin in the game I think is not actually an unreasonable answer, but it's not a game theory solution. But I think that there's like this other way to keep people with skin in the game, which is just that, you know, you instead of like, you know, requiring that they have lots of money, you make it so that they're like subject to and part of this political process. So like in my opinion, there's this like big political process that is like really driving governance, and I think that like people have skin in the game because they are stakeholders in the political process that are affected by the decisions. I think like loads of people have skin in the game that are not coin holders and are participating in blockchain governance because they have skin in the game. So I think that like, you know, just because of the nature of political action as something that's motivated by skin in the game and the nature of the system as a political system, it is going to be, you know, the skin in the game element is there. And I think the politics actually is super interesting because people have different incentives and different outcomes that they prefer, which I think is lost in the coin holder thing, where it's just like one interest group, which I think is like, you know, just terrifying that we would put one interest group in charge when we have so many different diverse interest groups that we need to represent, and or who are at least impacted by the decisions that we make.
I think that calling them one interest group is really oversimplifying it. Just like calling node operators one group of people is oversimplifying it. There's a lot of people behind that metric that we can. Seven?
7 coin holders control majority.
Yeah, okay, but like there's a lot of different incentives and interests and incentives behind those coin holders that are definitely beyond just the fact that they have a coin. And same thing with node operators. Running a node doesn't mean I like my software running fast on my VPS and keeping my node running because I like the network. It means a lot of other things behind that as well.
Well, I do think node operator interests are way more diverse than coin holder interests. I mean, even just from talking to coin holders and talking to node operators. I mean, coin holders just concern troll me all day about one Casper, one sharding. You know, node operators I feel like are much more diverse. But you know, this is just my experience, and who knows.
Okay, we've got time for one last question if anyone has a burning one they want to get on to the panel. Otherwise, we'll let you go to coffee. Okay. Yeah, thank you very much to